Hello. Today, Bards in the Basement will be doing a reading of Felix Mnthali's poem, The Stranglehold of English Lit. Mnthali is a poet, 20th century poet. He was born in southern Rhodesia, which is no longer in existence, if you will. It was part of the British Empire. It achieved its independence in 1980. Mnthali explores the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized in this poem, and will suggest that English literature is part of the colonization process. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see the poem. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see some of the literary devices I will discuss and mention as I go through the poem. Quickly, let me read through them, so when I refer back to them, you have some idea, some understanding what I mean. The first term is in medias res, in or into the middle of a narrative or plot. We jump right into some conversation, and we have to figure out what was said before we entered that. We'll see how that works in the poem. Free verse. This poetry has no set meter or rhyme. We do not have a typical iambic or tetrameter meter or rhyme scheme in this poem. Literary allusion, a brief and indirect reference to a person, place, or thing, or historical, cultural, literary, or political significance. We will have references to Jane Austen, literary allusion to Jane Austen. Biblical allusion uses words and or situations that make direct references to biblical stories, characters, places, motifs within larger story or text. We will have an example of biblical allusion here. Rhetorical question are questions that are asked for effect with no answer expected. It's for us, the reader, to ruminate, to think about as we go through the text. And then a longer definition is post-colonial theory. Post-colonial theory looks at the broader interactions between European nations and the societies they colonize by dealing with issues such as identity, including gender, race, and class, language, representation, and history. Because native languages and culture were replaced or superseded by European traditions in colonial societies, part of post-colonial project is reclamation. And we'll see how this poet it raises those questions. How do we respond to the larger world in a language, in a narrative, in art that was imposed upon us by our colonizer. So that relationship between the colonizer and the colonized is central to this poem. It's a theme that you'll find in literature from India, many countries in Africa, where the writer is trying to say, how do I offer a critique of my colonizer in a language that was imposed upon me, given to me by my colonizer. We see that in Irish literature as well. All right, so those are some of the literary terms that I will be mentioning as I go through the poem with you. And so let us now jump to the poem, The Stranglehold of English Lit by Felix Mnthali. Those questions, sister, those questions, stand, stab, jab, and gore too close to the center. For if we asked why Jane Austen's people carouse all day and do no work, would Europe in Africa have stood the test of time? And would she still maul the flower of our youth in the South, would she? Your elegance of deceit, Jane Austen, lulled the sons and daughters of the dispossessed into calf love, with irony and satire round imaginary people, while history went on mocking the victims of branding irons and sugar plantations that made Jane Austen's people wealthy beyond compare. Lit, my sister, was more than a cruel joke. It was the heart of alien conquest. How could questions be asked at Macaire and Ibadan, Dakar, Ford Hare, with Jane Austen at the center? How could they be answered? So the first thing I want to note is the opening stanza. The opening stanza, and this is a wonderful example of in medias res. Those questions, sister. Those questions. So we now have to imagine what that question or those questions that were asked by a student in the class. possibly, Professor, why are we reading Jane Austen? Professor, why do we read Dickens, Austen, Shakespeare? Our curriculum is so aligned with the European curriculum, the curriculum of our colonizers. So those might be some of the questions, some questions that were asked before we entered the poem. And so the speaker of the poem, I'm assuming it's the instructor, the professor. Those questions, sister, those questions: stand, stab, jab, and gore. Notice those words, all those one-syllable words have a act of violence, if you will, or an aggression, if you will. Those questions: stand, stab, jab, gore. Too close to the center. They get too close to a truth, or too close to a subject that we don't want to talk about or discuss, possibly. They stab, jab, gore, too close to the center. For if we asked why Jane Austen's people carouse all day and do no work, if we asked those questions, the answers would be this: they carouse all day and do no work because they have made money off of the slave trade. They have made their riches off of the slave trade. So don't ask those questions. But going back to the next stanza, would Europe in Africa have stood the test of time? Notice that's a really nice phrase or nice question there. Would Europe in Africa? The Europeans, what they did is they tried to recreate Europe in Africa. Not blend in, not assimilate African culture, but recreate. Would Europe in Africa have stood the test of time? If we started asking these questions about Jane Austen, if we started asking these questions about the structure of our universities, would Europe stood so long in Africa? Maybe it would have collapsed sooner. But also notice that Europe has stood in Africa. Europe has created the university system, has created parts of Africa, or superimposed itself over African culture. All right? And would she still maul, that wonderful word maul, tear apart? It goes along with that stand, jab, stab, gore, maul. The flower, that's such a violent maul next to the word flower, close to the word flower. Tear apart the flower of our youth. Something beautiful, something blossoming, something wonderful in the South. Would she? And you can't help but think of the crimes committed against the blacks of South Africa. Would if we ask these questions, would South Africa and apartheid have existed for such a long time, or would it have ended sooner? So, sister, you're asking these difficult questions that are too close to the heart of the matter of the colonial empire, or too close to the relationship of the colonizer and the colonized. Your elegance of deceit, Jane Austen. So here we have the Jane Austen mentioned for the second time, and this would be an example of literary illusion. Jane Austen's novels are novels, satires. They're comedy of manners, if you will. It's not uncommon for the drama that unfolds in a Jane Austen novel to be who am I going to have my daughter marry? What prospects do my daughters have in the future? Oh, I need to find the right man for my daughter, if you will. Will they find true love? So these novels are wonderful. They are wonderful novels. They're beautiful. They're romantic, and they're funny to read. So going back to the poem, your elegance of deceit, Jane Austen. These fictions, these are lies, but they're done so beautifully. Lulled the sons and daughters of the dispossessed, those people that have lost their land, those people that have lost their property, those people that have lost their culture, the sons and daughters of the dispossessed. So the colonized, into calf love. Now, calf love is a biblical illusion. The idea of calf love, that when Moses went to the mountaintop to speak with God and receive the Ten Commandments. The people were lost faith, and they started making a golden calf and started worshiping the golden calf and this false god. And so here we have the poet using the people of the dispossessed, the sons and daughters of the dispossessed, into calf love. The false god that they started to worship was the European culture, the English writer, and you lulled the sons and daughters, Jane Austen. You lulled them into calf love. That they're, oh my goodness, this is a beautiful book. This is a wonderful book. Oh, these characters are so delightful to encounter. These characters in Jane Austen novels that sit about eating sandwiches and drinking tea and playing croquet, that do no work because they have made their money, their fortune off the slave trade. And so we have the people of the colonized people reading them, falling in love with them, and not asking those questions like, how'd they get their riches? Maybe we shouldn't love these people. All right. Now, I once again, that going back to that stanza, your elegance of deceit. Beautiful language. You deceived us, Jane Austen. You lulled, kind of like lulled us to sleep, if you will, the sons and daughters of the dispossessed into calf love. We worshipped you. We worshipped this false god, this European god, this European literary tradition, with irony and satire around imaginary people. These people weren't real. They were fictions, and we fell in love with them. The real people in Jane Austen's stories, the real people of Jane Austen's time, some of them were making money off of the slave trade, making money off of the investment in the colonial empire. And so those people in Jane Austen books are imaginary people. The real people, they were not so wonderful. All right, scrolling up a little bit. While history went on mocking the victims of branding irons and sugar plantations that made Jane Austen's people wealthy beyond compare. While history, literary history possibly, where you'd have a character that is part of a novel, a black character that may have been there just for verisimilitude, a character there to invoke some sympathy but would not be central to the story, that they would not be truly realized characters. They may populate the plantations in the South. They may be caricatures. They might be romantic visions of what it was like on a plantation. The conversation about whether we should still be watching Gone with the Wind, which offers an absolutely ahistorical view of what life on a plantation was like. Those types of caricatures are mocking, because they don't represent the truth of those sugar plantations, those plantations throughout the South or throughout Africa, if you will. So we have while history mocked the victims of branding irons, that violence perpetrated on enslaved people, and those people that were in Jane Austen's novel, they were wealthy beyond compare. Ing-lit. Now look at the phrase "ing-lit" there. That's the abbreviation you see in a college catalog. For what class should I take? Well, Ing-lit 101, Ing-lit 102, Ing-lit. So here we have English literature, the study of English literature. Ing-lit, my sister. Reminding us of the first stanza of the poem. Those questions, sister. So Ing-lit, my sister. And so he's getting closer to the answer. The speaker was more than a cruel joke. It was more than just the mocking that we saw in novels. It was more than a cruel joke. It was at the heart of alien conquest. There was a saying that the greatest export of the British Empire was their language. If we can export our language, throughout the world. We will export our culture, our narrative, our values. And so that English lit was part of one of the arms of colonization and empire building. Just as the missionary work could be seen as that. The first thrust of colonization were the missionaries that went out to convert. So Eng Lit is part of that colonization process. My Sister was more than a cruel joke. It's not just funny stories by Jane Austen. It was the heart of alien conquest. It was centered to the alien conquest. I can't help when I read that line also to hear The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, and how Conrad essentialized the blacks of Africa. Read Heart of Darkness by Conrad, and then read Achebe's Things Fall Apart. Nice conversation going on between those two books, if you will. But if we get them to buy our stories, the British Empire, if you will, and get them to like our narratives, fall in love, worship people like Jane Austen and the characters they meet, we will be able to conquer them. It's at the heart of alien conquest. How could questions be asked at Mekir and Ibn Dan, Dakar, Fort Hare? Those are all major cities with universities at the center of those cities. Major universities are in those cities. Those questions, how can we ask those questions with Jane Austen at the center of our curriculum, at the center of our intellectual studies is Jane Austen. And Jane Austen, I want you to think of not just her novels, but what she symbolizes. British culture, English culture, the stories, the novels, the plays, the poetry. Some of the stories are absolutely wonderful. I mean, there's a rich history there. But they also should be seen, this poet is saying, you should also acknowledge that they are part of empire building. They are part of colonization. And so he wants us to ask those questions and think about those questions. Why don't we have African folklore, African mythology, African novelists, African poetry, African arts at the center of our universities? Why Jane Austen at the center? How could they be answered? Well, this is how it's always been done. This is how the universities are set up across the world. So how could they be answered? So it raises the question between the colonizer and the colonized. The colonized now has voice. Felix Mnthali has a voice, and he's going to ask questions about how the universities are structured, how education is structured, and wants the reader to think about that as well. All right. So here is a nice example, as I said, of post-colonial discourse that asks questions, raises issues about race, class, education, culture, literature in particular, and wants us to ruminate and think about them. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that walk through the poem, and you'll find some more poetry by Felix Mnthali to read, and also investigate some more post-colonial poets, novelists, and thinkers. One last comment, and I think it's an important comment, is about the title of the poem, The Stranglehold of English Lit. The stranglehold is it's English literature and its place within the curriculum, English literature and its place figuratively in the world of the colonized, is choking the life out of them. It is dangerous. It is deadly. So it's suggesting that English literature, English culture, is still something deadly to the colonized. And maybe the schools should revamp, reconsider, restructure their curriculum. And maybe it should not be Eurocentric. All right. Just wanted to make sure I addressed the title before ending. Thank you again.